I want to say just thank you for all being here. And I was curious if anyone wanted to share a mindful moment that they had this week. I'm trying to think of my own mindful moment as we wait. I think as usual for most of us, I think a lot of us can relate to the idea of nature being a mindful moment, and being outside can be a great source of mindfulness for us. Just hearing the birds, seeing the trees and nature, and kind of interacting and engaging with our surroundings is a really great mindful moment. Ice cream night with your girls, awesome. That actually slips quite nicely into our topic today, which is talking about being social and being mindful while you're being social. Celebrating Father's Day, looking over the ocean and seafood. Wow, that sounds like a perfect night. Great. Yeah, when you're engaging in kind of any sort of creative activity, I think oftentimes we actually talk about in art a flow state that you get into when you're making art, when you are hyper focused into the making art, and so that definitely could be considered mindfulness. Absolutely. Great. Awesome. You guys had some great mindful moments. I personally can't think of anything. My mind is blank a little bit right now, so I can't share my own, but I really appreciated hearing all of yours. So we're going to get started. Like I said, this is week 7. And again, most of us talked today actually about interacting with other people, which again is a really great segue into our mindfully social week. So this week we're going to be focusing on, again, using our mindfulness skills in relationships, so in interpersonal relationships, whether that be with friends, whether that be with relationships and partners, whether that be with family members, co-workers, etc. So interpersonal effectiveness skills are a composite of social skills, assertiveness, and listening skills. Relationships are really precious and they're really vulnerable for us, right? We, as human beings, we have this natural need to connect with others. That comes from, needing our caregivers to survive, right? So we have this innate need to connect with others. And in saying that, it also is a space where we can be our most vulnerable too. A lot of times when we experience overwhelming emotions, or we are more sensitive or more stressed out, or whatever the case may be, our relationships are kind of where maybe that stress, or maybe that those emotions kind of play out a little bit. And you might notice, hey, I am feeling really stressed out because you're snapping at your partner more, or you're being a little less tolerant with your children, or whatever the case may be, right? So our relationships are a great mirror into what's going on for us, because again, when we're interacting with others, how we feel and how what's going on for us really does affect the interaction with that other person. So relationships bring love and companionship and support to us, but sometimes kind of in a matter of moments, kind of at the flip of the switch, they can become really broken, maybe sometimes even beyond repair. So keeping our relationships healthy and alive really requires good, healthy interpersonal skills, which I hope that we'll be able to learn a little bit more about during this week. So this is a necessary and important skill to develop, again, in terms of understanding that we do need our relationships and they are very important to us. So how can we ensure that we are engaging in those relationships in the best way possible? Again, we're not perfect. We're not asking for perfection here, but just to gain more understanding and maybe awareness of how we can improve those relationships, even when we're feeling overwhelmed, when we're feeling stressed out, when things are going wrong. So the most necessary of our skills that we're going to talk about is assertiveness. So this is the ability to ask for what you want, to say no, and to negotiate conflict without damaging the relationship. So before we learn more about assertiveness, though, there are some key things that we need to know. So as we've been talking about, we all understand the idea that mindfulness is a really simple but really powerful practice. So it has the possibility of transforming our relationships. It cultivates some foundational attitudes towards ourselves and others. So it gives rise to non-judgmental awareness and noticing any arising experiences that we're having. It also talks about it teaches us about acceptance, about presence, openness, spaciousness, letting go, empathy, calmness. And these are all kind of, I guess, key words that we've touched on in all of the weeks that we've been doing this. And it's also about awakening the heart to loving kindness and compassion for, again, ourselves and for others. So there's lots of really great benefits of mindfulness. And I guess individually, those benefits really, again, benefit us as individuals. But as a collective whole, these things can really benefit our relationships with others. And I don't know if many of you, if you have been really diligently practicing and kind of engaging in the work that we've been doing the past 7 weeks, if you have noticed a difference in the relationships that you're having in your life, if you've been calmer with people, if you've been able to engage more mindfully with other people rather than letting those kind of like hair triggers kind of set you off. Like it is a benefit of engaging in these mindfulness practices. So just like we kind of talk about, right, mindfulness is about paying attention on purpose with an intention and non-judgmental. So relationships do require our attention. So whether it's with an intimate partner, whether a friend, a coworker, or just even kind of a stranger or an acquaintance, right? Maintaining good relationships depends on noticing the other person's feelings, and reactions, and then watching the process between the two of you. So one, you're paying attention to your own reactions, then you're paying attention to the reactions of other people, and then you're also watching for the reaction that's happening between the two of you. So paying attention means staying in the here and now. So not thinking of what you want to say next, or focusing on a memory that you might be having, or even focusing on your to-do list that you have coming up. But it's really about paying attention to what's happening in the present in that interaction. You have to pay attention to what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and what you're sensing, maybe emotionally, both, again, in yourself and maybe in the other person that you're talking with. So in the same way that you breathe, walk, or even do our dishes mindfully, you can also relate with full awareness to the present moment in relationships. So when you pay attention, you may be able to more quickly notice trouble coming before it overwhelms you, before it takes over. And it also helps you gain time to ask clarifying questions that can help create more understanding and kind of mitigate any misconceptions that you may have about what's happening in the interaction, right? So I'm sure many of us can relate to the idea that when we are talking with somebody and you start to feel the sense of discomfort or frustration, and you're just like, you get upset about something. Notice if you were paying attention right before you started feeling frustrated. And if you weren't, then it is really important to ask clarifying questions. I think it's important to ask clarifying questions anyways, but sometimes, especially when we're not being mindful or we haven't really been paying attention as much, it makes it even more important to ask those questions, because again, it may just be that if we're not paying attention, right? If we're thinking about our to-do list and our groceries that we have to pick up, or the kids getting to soccer later, or whatever it is that you're kind of preoccupied with, then you're not really paying attention to the nuances of what's happening in your conversation, which can lead you to likely misinterpreting or having a different perception of what's actually going on. And when this happens, this can lead to conflict, it can lead to tension, it can lead to frustration on both parts, right? So asking those clarifying questions is really important in being able to kind of navigate conflict and maybe even prevent conflict from coming up. So when we're not paying attention, focusing away from that moment, like I just talked about, sometimes you might do some of the following. So you might miss vital cues about the other person's needs and reaction. You might project inaccurately your fears and feelings on the other person. You might end up blowing up or even running away when you're surprised by a negative response that you could have seen coming had you been paying more attention to what was happening between you and the other person, rather than kind of getting stuck in your own head. So mindful attention involves watching your own experience in relation to others as well. So some questions that we can ask ourselves in these moments is, do you need something from the other person? For example, more attention or help? Do you need to change the process between you and the other person? So for example, critical comments, demands, intrusive questions. So if this is the case, right, you're going to somehow express that you are uncomfortable with the way that they're asking the question, and to, again, like, have them understand that that's not okay for you. Another question you could ask yourself is, do you have feelings that signal something important about what's going on? So are you feeling hurt? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling a sense of loss, maybe shame, anxiety? So again, tuning into how you're doing emotionally, because that can again, when we understand how we are feeling and we pay attention to our own emotions, that can give us information about maybe how our behaviors are influencing the interaction, how our own thoughts are interacting in terms of our perception of what's happening. So just as we talked about last week in terms of noticing how our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are all interconnected, and they kind of act together. So just like we're in relationship with others, all of those things are still influencing our interactions with another person. So noticing our feelings can help you figure out what you need to change in a relationship, again, before it reaches the point where you either blow up or you have this need to run away. So even in a text conversation that we can have, you can start to practice being an observer of the moment by attending to the other person's physical and verbal behavior. In a text conversation, it's more going to be verbal, and maybe their punctuation, their use of emojis, use of exclamation points or question marks or that kind of thing. So there's lots of ways that we understand people's emotions, even through a text message. But again, you have to be mindful and paying attention to those things to notice them. If you do find that you are dealing with somebody, or maybe in this moment, it's ambiguous, or you're finding them hard to read, again, there's certain clarifying questions that you can ask in order to kind of better facilitate, one, conversation, and two, to make sure that we're navigating, avoiding that conflict or avoiding any blow-ups. So questions like, how are you feeling? Are you doing okay? How are we doing? Are we okay? How are things between us? I noticed blank. Is that accurate? So kind of directly asking, like, I'm noticing this. Is this true or not? Is everything okay with you? Is everything okay with us? Okay? So these are pretty simple questions. But again, sometimes when we get again, I'm of the belief that relationships they're beautiful and they're necessary and they're important, but they're also kind of situations that can be really triggering for people. I mean, a lot of our pain occurs in the context of relationships and at the hand of other people sometimes. And when that's the case, then it can be really easy for us to develop triggers and sensitivities to tone, to body language, to just minor shifts in behavior. And when that happens, it's really hard to kind of pause and pull yourself back and ask those questions to really understand what's happening, because you're triggered, right? You're feeling really emotional. Say, for example, your partner you're sensing that they're pulling away from you a little bit. This can be extremely triggering for people. But instead of being able to ask the question of like, hey, like, what's going on? Are you okay? We kind of internalize and tend to kind of to personalize, I guess, that response. And again, we start to think inwardly rather than outwardly. So we're not paying attention to maybe what's going on for them, and we're really hyper focused on how we feel ourselves. So again, when we start to notice those shifts or maybe that discomfort in ourselves, especially in the context of our relationships, it can be really helpful to ask these questions, again, in order to clarify so that we don't jump to conclusions. And then we can also avoid that kind of buildup of feelings of kind of wondering and questioning and doubting and getting into that kind of tailspin there. It's also really important to notice your own needs and feelings in the interaction. So we just kind of focus on, again, maybe paying more attention to the other person and how they're doing. But again, we also have to pay attention to our own feelings and needs as well. Do these require communication? Do we have to kind of voice that, I'm feeling a little anxious right now because of blank? is this actually what's happening? Like, can you offer me a little bit of reassurance maybe? And asking for what you need is a really important part of a relationship, because people can't read our minds as much as we would love them to. And sometimes we have the expectation of our partners in particular, and maybe even family members and friends, to be able to understand what we need and want. And I think sometimes we might have the misconception that if they cared enough, or if they were in tune with us enough, that they would just understand, or they would just get it. And yes, sometimes our partners are very in tune with us, but everyone has their own stuff. We're all human. We can't be kind of attending to somebody else 100% of the time. So we might miss some things. So being really clear and direct about what you need is going to be really helpful in terms of, again, clarifying anything and making sure that you're getting your needs met just as much as your partner or your friend or your family member is getting their needs met as well. We also have to be mindful too of when you are kind of expressing a need, how can you say this in a way that preserves the relationship? So sometimes when we are frustrated and we feel like a need isn't being met, we can kind of jump to conclusions. We might feel really defensive and angry, maybe. That feeling can come up a lot, and that can lead to, again, conflict, right? Or if we present that information, if really what we need is attention, say, for example, but instead of being able to voice that directly, we feel really vulnerable about that need for attention. So we feel defensive or maybe uncomfortable. So instead of asking for that in a way that's going to facilitate what you need, if you ask it in a defensive way, that's going to make the other person get defensive, and then nothing is achieved there. So again, being really mindful of how you're feeling and noticing what's going on for you, so that that doesn't influence deeply, I guess, the way that you're presenting that information to your partner. So in summary, with all of that, that first interpersonal skill that we need to cultivate is mindful attention. And this is what we've been kind of focusing on, and a lot of our activities in the past weeks have really kind of focused on that idea of developing mindful attention. Because again, it's going to help you notice really important signals about the state of a relationship, whether in yourself, in the other person, and then as a whole, and interacting together. Does anyone have any, before I just move on, does anyone have any questions or anything about what I just spoke about? Just want to check in before we move forward. Maybe take a sip of my coffee too. No? Okay. All right. So now we're going to move into communication. Okay. So in improving our interpersonal skills really does take a lot of work. Communication skills are, they're tough. They're really important, and they're really valuable, and it's something that we use every day, right? I'm communicating with you right now. You guys are communicating back with me in the chat, where we use it constantly. And yet it's one of those things that we don't really learn much about, and we don't really understand fully. So it's interesting, because it's a skill that we use all the time, and it's really important, but yet we don't really have, I guess, like, quote unquote, training in maybe appropriate or healthy ways of communication. At least in my experience in school, that was not really focused on until like I said, until I got into counseling and into later years of my schooling. That's when that became more, I guess, more important. So yeah, most of us don't really have that knowledge or background to really understand communication and understand that at a deeper level. You don't need anyone to tell you how difficult it is to change relationship patterns. Just as it's hard to change our communication and understand that, changing relationship patterns, which can include communication styles, can be really tough. It's not an easy thing to do, and it requires a lot of effort, on an active effort and participation on the part of yourself. But we also know why they're important, right? Developing good communication skills, and again, maybe paying attention to where we need to improve in terms of our relationships, are all really important things to understand and to have knowledge of. And this is important because if we don't do these, if we don't attend to this, then our relationships can sometimes go downhill, and they can end because we are not able to communicate effectively, or we have certain patterns in our relationships that are detrimental to that relationship itself. And this can sometimes lead to that idea of you know, not knowing, you didn't really know how to fix things, right? So these relationships kind of blow up in your face and things end, and we're kind of left like, well, what just happened? It kind of blows you over and you don't really understand what went wrong. So part of, like we've said earlier at the start of the presentation, an important piece of communication is assertive communication. So it's the ability to express your opinions in an open, honest, direct way. It allows us to take responsibility for ourselves without judging or blaming others. And communicating assertively means expressing your ideas in a civilized way without being too aggressive or, on the opposite end, too passive. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, just like with any kind of communication style. And sometimes you may even forget to use it. So again, we're human, we make mistakes, or we're not able to be, I guess, 100% mindful and kind of intentional with everything all of the time. So that can lead to sometimes not using that assertive communication and maybe falling into the passive communication style or the aggressive communication style. But you'll also be really amazed at how great assertive communication can be to facilitate conversation and to help improve a problem. So again, most people, I would say, fall into the passive or the aggressive column. And in our next slide, we're going to go through those a little bit more in detail. So most of us fall into those two communication styles, which again, both of them have their own, I guess, issues and problems that can be, again, detrimental to communication when you're talking with somebody else. So when you're able to be assertive, again, it's hard to make that shift and it takes a lot of effort. But once you do, you'll realize how much better it is in terms of facilitating that conversation and making sure you're getting your point across, but you're also hearing the other person as well. Okay, so we're going to go through these communication styles. We're going to focus on the passive, aggressive, and then assertive. If you want to read the passive aggressive column, you can do that as well. But when someone has a passive approach, we're going to start with that one. They tend to be too nice or perceived as maybe weak, overly compliant, and gives into conflict or gives in when conflict arises. They may avoid eye contact. They may speak really softly. They tend to put themselves down. They might be emotionally dishonest out of fear of how people will accept or reject their emotions. They might allow other people to maybe walk all over them and tend to be bullied sometimes. When someone is aggressive, they may come across as mean or harsh, maybe sarcastic. They are viewed as takers. They use really direct, glaring eye contact. They may speak loudly and use threatening tones. They tend to put other people down. They are inappropriately honest, so maybe using honesty too often and maybe at the wrong moments. And they tend to walk all over others and are seen more as the bully rather than as bullied. So we want to be somewhere in, again, like I said, most of us kind of fall into the passive or the aggressive or a mix of the two, the passive aggressive. But we want to fall more into that green category, which is the assertive. So when people are assertive, they're firm, but they're polite. They compromise with people. They're seen as warm, friendly, and use eye contact appropriately. They speak in a conversational tone rather than either, again, too softly or too aggressively. They build up others and themselves. They are appropriately honest, and they stand up for themselves. So part of practicing assertive communication will help you be more effective in your dealings with people. It might improve your ability to get your needs met. Again, because part of assertive communication is being able to say, no, I don't want to do that, or yes, I do want to do that. And it also helps you, again, be direct about and honest about what you want and clear so that other people aren't misinterpreting what you're trying to say. It might help you negotiate conflicts without damaging the relationship. And it can strengthen your self-respect by giving you alternatives to old, maybe damaging patterns of anger or withdrawal. So those are really important tips there on how assertive communication can serve you. Okay, so we are going to go through a little quiz here. So I want everyone to think about their over a recent interaction with somebody important in your life. And make a little mental note of which numbers you relate to, okay? So I go along with something even if I don't like it. I push people to do what's right, even if there's an upset. I try to be pleasant and easygoing no matter what people do or say. I give people a piece of my mind when they deserve it. I always try to be sensitive to what other people need and feel, even if my own needs get lost in the process. I know what I want and insist on it, even if it means having to get angry. When there is conflict, I tend to give in and let things go the other person's way. When people don't do what is appropriate or reasonable, I don't let them get away with it. I'll pull away from a relationship rather than say anything that could be upsetting. You can't let people continue being selfish or stupid. You have to shake them until they see what they're doing. I leave people alone, let them be whatever they are. And lastly, I ignore my needs or insist on things that don't work for me. I get more and more upset until they pay attention. So, if you tended to mark odd numbers, your predominant style is passive. If you checked more even numbers, you may have a tendency to have more of an aggressive problem-solving style. Does anyone want to share what they got, what their score was, if they tended to be more passive or more aggressive? Passive? Right in the middle, okay. So if you were a blend, then I'm assuming, it doesn't say in terms of the notes, but I'm assuming that would mean that you might have a more of a passive aggressive style, like we talked about we didn't talk about it, but it was in that last slide there in the middle. So we tend to have, no one scored aggressive though. And maybe if you did, that's okay and didn't share, but if from the chat, it seems like everyone was either passive aggressive or passive. And like I said, that's pretty common. It's not a bad thing. It's just normal. I think that a lot of times with the way that we're taught to communicate, there's a lot of, I guess, kind of little like rules or norms that we tend to follow, like you don't speak out against authority, or kind of you're seen not heard, all of those, I guess, those kind of cliche things that you can say about especially children, and maybe the way that you were raised, that can really influence the way you develop communication and the style that you have. So if you were someone who, I guess, again, you were taught not to question authority, to just follow the rules and just never kind of go against the grain. And again, as a kid, you were told you were seen, not heard. So all of those things can lead to that passive style being developed. And again, this is not anyone's fault. It's not a choice. It was something that we learned over time, either through our caregivers, maybe a family member of ours has a similar communication style to us and we learned it from them. But it's just part of who you are. It's just the way that you developed, and it's not wrong. It's just, I guess, the more you're aware of these things and you have a mindful attention to it, the better you're going to be able to, I guess, choose to maybe act differently in these situations where you could be more assertive. Okay. So every relationship consists of two people trying to get what they need. Sometimes they need the same thing. So companionship, recreation, calm and quiet, it's easy. But when we need different things from the people that we're in a relationship with, and this happens at the same time, when one person needs something different and I also need something different, or when someone needs something that the other person isn't willing to give, then that can cause trouble. So for relationships to be successful, you must be able to do the following. You need to know and say what you desire. So again, expressing your needs clearly and directly. You need to notice or find out what the other person desires. So it's important to negotiate and compromise so that you can get at least some of what you need and want, and vice versa for the other person. And it's important that you give what you can of what the other person wants, again, in order to facilitate the relationship and to kind of make sure that the other person is getting their needs met, which again, when we're fulfilling somebody else's needs, and I'm not saying we do this to the detriment of ourselves, but when we are able to fulfill our partner's needs, they're going to be more likely to want to and to facilitate our own needs. Not all the time. There's a lot of relationships that can be uneven, but again, if both people are willing and have open communication and are able to be together in that way, then by you giving, you're also going to receive back. So there's different ratios here that are important. So if the I want, they want, so what I want and what the other person wants isn't balanced, that can cause, again, what we talked about, that instability in the relationship. So paying attention to what each person desires and using assertiveness skills to negotiate conflicts is really vital to maintaining that balance and maintaining our healthy relationships. So we also have an I want, I should ratio. So every relationship requires keeping a delicate balance between seeking what you want to do and doing what you think you should do for the good of the relationship or for the benefit of the other person. So if most of your focus is directed towards getting and doing what you want with really little attention to what must be done or the other person, you'll soon earn resentment from the other person. So if we're overbalanced and not on the side of the shoulds, I should, how should you act? What should you do for the other person, right? If we're not thinking of those things, if we're not taking into account of how our actions are influencing our partners, then the relationship will begin to feel joyless. It might feel like a burden, and you likely will dream of escaping. So there's a little checklist here of what we talk about is the shoulds. So anytime in sessions with clients, if they say, well, I should do that, or I should know this, or anytime a should comes up, that's instantly a little trigger for me to be like, okay, where does that come from, right? These beliefs came from somewhere, and sometimes our shoulds, they're not always accurate, right? So in the next little section here, there's a little list of should statements. And the more items you check in this list, the stronger your beliefs about the right and wrong way to relate to others, and the more likely you are to deny your own needs in a relationship, which again can cause issues. So there's nothing wrong in having values about how you treat others, but if those values overpower your ability to ask for what you want, you'll end up feeling helpless in any relationship. Okay? So I don't have the quiz up on the screen. I'm not sure why that didn't happen, but I will post them in the chat here. They're all there. All right, so I'm going to go through them. So again, just kind of take mental note or make a check mark between all of the ones that you relate to. So you should try to give everything and that's asked of you in a relationship, even when it means putting your own needs aside. When someone is in pain, you should do anything required to help them. You should be caring and considerate at all times. You shouldn't ask for something if you know the other person doesn't want to give it. There is a right way to act with people, and it should be followed, even if it means keeping quiet about your feelings and needs. You shouldn't express feelings that might upset somebody. It's wrong. You should respond to the needs of others because their needs are a high priority. You should never hurt or offend anyone. You should try not to disappoint others. Others, and I guess so other people's needs are valid and understandable. And again, it draws on that last little section there. It says it draws on the willingness to compromise so that each person gets what he or she wants, right? So I guess I'm curious, like out of all of those shoulds, How many did people check off out of all those categories? Almost all of them. Okay. So again, it's not wrong to have, again, really strong beliefs about right or wrong. But again, I would ask myself and be curious, for those of you who did kind of relate to all of these statements, how do these beliefs, because that's what they are, they're beliefs, how do these beliefs, I guess, help you in relationships, and how do they hurt you in relationships? So be curious about what it is that how they serve you in some way, because I would imagine that in a lot of ways, these can be barriers in your relationships to getting what you want and having your own needs met. So especially when we kind of give ourselves away, like when someone is in pain, you should do anything required to help them. That one, yes, of course, when our loved ones are in pain, we're I guess it's an innate thing to want to help and to make sure that they feel better, but that can't come at the detriment and the cost of your own mental well-being and your own safety, I guess. So if you're kind of constantly finding yourself in situations where you're over giving, that's really draining. Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. It's super draining if you give too much. So I guess, and especially you should be caring and considerate at all times, going over that one. If we're always caring and considerate, sometimes that can lead to us getting, feeling rejected. It could feel us feeling disrespected, and again, feeling hurt, and maybe someone says something to us that's not okay, but we're not able to express that because we feel like that would be rude or it wouldn't be considerate to say something, right? So it prevents you from being honest about how you're feeling and honest about what's going on for you, even if you're right? Like, even if this person's being extremely rude, but you have the belief, well, no, I need to be caring and I need to be considerate. Well, then you're letting this person treat you badly at the detriment to yourself. Right. So Angela said, it prevents you from taking your anger and frustration out on others. Absolutely. And again, sometimes these beliefs are helpful in the sense that they may, yeah, like you said, prevent you from taking your anger and frustration out in inappropriate ways. But if you aren't able to express that you're angry or frustrated with your partner, with your friends, with your family, then that's causing your needs to go unmet and your boundaries to be disrespected, and that's not a healthy thing either, right? So there's I guess a healthy way to express your anger and frustration. It doesn't mean you have to blow up, but it does mean that your anger and frustration and the reasons why you are important and they're valid, and the people you're in relationship with should care about that and should want to attend to that if it comes up. But yeah, like you said, pick your battles, right? And is this going to be important later? I mean, again, I think that comes along with that mindful attention, right? When we're paying attention to the reasons why we're angry, then that can help us decide, okay, am I angry because of what this person's doing? And is it valid? It's always valid. The feeling is always valid, but is I guess the reasoning behind it, is it coming from them? Is it something that they directly did? Or is this a thought that we're having? Is it a trigger for us from a past relationship or a past situation? And that's why we're frustrated. So again, just having that mindful attention can really help you, like Angela said, take a step back and figure out what it is that's causing the emotion or causing that frustration. So you're able to be more, I guess, conscientious about how you're reacting to it, rather than just kind of reacting out of instinct or gut feelings, which isn't always bad, but in terms of anger, sometimes it can lead to problems. And again, I think it's important if you did relate to a lot of those questions and a lot of those shoulds, it's really, you could be in a relationship with a lot of people in your life where it's really imbalanced, where you're giving a lot and there's not much, you're giving out and you're not able to take much because other people are constantly taking, and that's an imbalance, right? So checking in with yourself and saying, how do these things, I guess, become barriers to me? How do they help me? And maybe how can I adjust these beliefs so that I'm able to get my needs met just as much as I'm meeting other people's needs? And again, something to think about with assertive communication is that a lot of times we perceive assertiveness as being rude. A lot of us tend to have a passive communication style. It feels to us like if we were to tell people what we need and what we want, that we're being too direct, we're being rude or insensitive, or I guess fill in the blank of whatever word comes up for you. But in reality, you being assertive and saying, hey, like, this is what I need from you. That's not you being rude. That's you expressing what you need. And that's going to help the relationship, right? It shouldn't harm the relationship. I'm saying should. It shouldn't harm the relationship for you to ask what you need. And if it does, then I would question, well, how is this relationship? And is this really serving me, right? And kind of getting really honest with yourself about where that relationship stands if that person is unwilling to meet your needs, even though you're kind of going above and beyond to meet theirs. So these should questions can sometimes bring up a lot of reflection in terms of how we relate to each other, how we act in relationships, and maybe where it can also point to where we might need to do a little bit more work in terms of kind of being more assertive, and kind of adjusting our belief system to, again, get our own needs met just as much as we're meeting other people's. So we have some key tips for relationships. So we have 6 core skills that can really help you change your relationships, and kind of enhance them in some ways. So the first one is knowing what you want. So how do you know what you want in a relationship? In some cases, you might sense the yearning, or you're really aware of discomfort. But the key is to pay attention and look for a way to describe in your own mind what you're feeling, right? So it's really important to know what you want, because you can't be assertive with somebody if you have no idea what you want from them, right? So getting really clear with yourself and maybe that requires you sitting in reflection with yourself and saying, okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling upset, I don't know why. So how can I figure out, 1, why am I feeling this discomfort? And 2, what do I need? And how can I communicate that so that I get my needs met, so that I know, and again, I'm expressing what I need and what I want from this relationship. The second part is, again, asking for what you want. This is really important for relationships, like we've talked about, right? It's really important to ask for what you need and to be assertive in that, and to feel comfortable being assertive in that. So in a way, this protects the relationship. The basic idea is that you put your needs into words that are clear, not attacking, and they ask for specific behavioral changes. So when you do this, again, it's setting the precedent, I guess, so that the person understands what your need is, what you expect, and they don't feel like you're attacking them. It's a mutual conversation. It's just a natural understanding, right? So it's that not attacking part can be really important there. And the way that you frame asking for what you need can really kind of it will kind of put into perspective, okay, is this going to get met, or is this person going to get defensive and just kind of shut down, right? So a third skill is negotiating. So negotiating conflicting wants, like we talked about, that I should ratio being imbalanced. So the willingness to negotiate starts with a clear commitment that there won't be winners and losers. It assumes that each person's needs are valid, and understandable, and it draws on a willingness to compromise so that each person gets some of what he or she wants. So this is really important, and maybe something that we can all kind of talk about with our partners or with our friends or loved ones, right? Is that idea that the whole purpose of having these tough conversations and airing out what we want and what we need, and maybe what we're not happy with or what we feel would benefit from a change, all of that can seem sometimes like it can cause defensiveness, and maybe that, again, that feeling of attacking. But I guess if it's put out there in a way that says, you know what, I'm doing this for the benefit of the relationship. I'm doing this because not because I want to win, or I want you to lose, or because I just need you to change because otherwise this isn't going to work for me. But it's saying, I want our relationship to be better. I want you to get what you need, and I want me to get what I need, and we need to have this conversation to facilitate that. So it's negotiating. It's not a fight, it's not a conflict, but it's just negotiating that and kind of, again, moving together towards a compromise that works good for both people. So a fourth skill is getting information. So one of the most crucial parts of interpersonal communication skills is finding out what the other person needs, fears, hopes for, and so on. So like I said, this is that idea of asking those clarifying questions and really understanding where the person is coming from. When we are frustrated and defensive, we tend to not think that way. And we don't kind of tune into what the other person wants, because we're really focused on how we're hurt and how we're upset. And major blocks to getting information that you might need in order to facilitate communication is to falsely assume you know what the other person wants without asking them, right? So assumptions are kind of a killer of communication, because again, when you assume, you haven't actually checked in with the person. You're making assumptions based on your own perceptions and your own experiences, which that other person might not have. You may project your fears, needs, and feelings on the other person, and that can also lead to a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of their own feelings. Fear about appearing to pry. So we may not ask questions out of fear of not wanting to look like we're kind of digging in or asking too many questions, or we don't want to look like we're being nosy. We might have a fear of hearing the worst answer, right? So we might not ask the question out of the fear that we might not get the answer that we want. Or the last one that blocks that kind of gathering information is that we don't know how to ask or what to look for. So again, being really clear on what you want and being clear on assertive communication is really important in terms of helping, again, to open communication, because it can, when we're not that way, when we have that fear of not knowing how to ask, that can, again, it shuts everyone down. It shuts you down, and you're not able to ask those questions that might be really helpful. A fifth skill is saying no. So you're doing this in a way that protects the relationship. You can say no in 3 different ways. You can say it in a timid, kind of passive style that just gets overridden and no one really hears you. You can say it in a really hard-edged, aggressive style that tends to alienate people or have people be like, whoa, why are you acting that way, right? And then that leads to further resentment and frustration, because you feel frustrated that your needs are getting dismissed and that your boundaries are being crossed, but it might just be the fact that they're reacting to the delivery rather than actually to the fact that you said no. And then lastly, the third style is you can say no in an assertive way that validates the other person's needs and desires, but setting firm boundaries around what you will and won't do. The first 2 strategies undermine relationships, so being passive or being aggressive, because someone is going to end up feeling controlled or resentful in either of those passive or kind of aggressive styles. But when you say no in an assertive way, again, it's validating the other person, but also setting those firm boundaries so that they understand what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. So 6, it's really important to act on your own values. So being passive or aggressive in a relationship diminishes both your self-respect and the self-respect of others, because someone is going to be losing out in the relationship. Someone's needs and feelings are being ignored if you're acting from a passive way or an aggressive way. Being clear about how you want to treat others is a critical step to interpersonal effectiveness. Ask yourself, what type of relationships do I want with other people? Do you want a loving relationship, a trustworthy relationship, or a committed relationship? Hopefully, as you've been using the skills and the exercise workbooks that we've talked about and we've done the past 6-7 weeks, it's going to start to sink in maybe what your value is in your relationships, and how maybe your own feelings and your own actions and behaviors and thoughts processes can interfere with those things. So acting in your relationships according to what you value is another really crucial step in determining the entire nature of your relationships. So again, if we're not aware of what we want and what we need, then we're not going to have that attention and be able to give that attention to other people, right? So that's a really crucial step, is really getting clear, like, what is it that I want? What do I need? And how can I communicate that in a way that someone's going to understand and respect? So we shouldn't really be surprised then to know that, you know, when we're not clear about our values and we have valueless relationships, that they don't tend to work out very well. So it's really important when we are in relationship, and if we want them to stay and we want to maintain them, that we set positive intentions and values for each of our relationships and act in those relationships according to what you're trying to achieve. So in saying that, I'm going to end there in terms of our key tips for relationships. Does anyone have any questions or wonderings or just things that they'd like to share? We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm glad to take any questions you might have. So if you don't have any questions, that's okay. I hope you guys took something away from this mindfully social talk. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. And if you, like I said, if you have no questions, you can feel free to head out. The workbook this week will kind of dive into more of that assertive communication and how to develop it. So I would take a look at that if you can. And otherwise, like I said, I'm here to answer any questions you might have. But if not, take care. Have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the sunshine if it's sunny for you and the heat. And I will see you next week for week 8.